So, in this unit, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, and that is deviance. We'll actually be talking about deviance, crime, and social control. But a lot of our focus is going to be on deviance and social control. And we'll do some light review of some of the concepts related to crime. So, I know what you're thinking. We've kind of talked about deviance before in the past, but we're going to do a more exhaustive focus on deviance. We're going to talk about what deviance is and how we define it and who gets to decide how deviance is defined, and about some of the theories related to deviance. So, starting with the definition of what is deviance, it's any behavior that violates norms, and you remember that norms are the standards of conduct or expectations of a group or society. So, it's the expected way that we will act and behave and interact. Deviance is not necessarily a negative thing, although it's typically used with a negative connotation. Deviance is any deviation from a norm. So if the norm, for example, would be to get a C in this course and you've got a D or an F, yes, you're deviating. But also, if you got an A or a B, you're also deviating away from the norm. And so it's really important to note that um, the connotation that's attached to deviance is not set in stone, and that it varies. Deviance in particular varies across time, space, and place. And so I want you to pay really good attention here because space and place students often get confused. So when I say that deviance varies across time, what I mean is that what was deviant or is deviant now may not be deviant in the future. What we consider to be deviant or inappropriate, or outside of the norm changes over time. You can think about some of the simplest things that we really take advantage of, as being natural and how they have changed over time. So, for example, you might look at colors, right? Um, in the past, people viewed pink as being a masculine color because it was a derivative of red, which was a color that was, seen as representing power. And they actually saw blue as being more of a feminine color. And this is mostly in Western societies. Um, but still, it's a really good example. And then continuing with fashion, some of the clothing types that we wear today would have been deviant in the past, like ladies wearing pants. And some of the things that men wore in the past, like high heels or like robes and dress-like garments, would be considered deviant today. Now, when I say deviance varies across space, what I mean is that what is deviant in one group may not be deviant in another. So, with space, think about social environment, the social space, right? What might be deviant in a group of your peers may not be deviant among a group of your coworkers or colleagues. And it's really important to emphasize that it's not necessarily place here because you could stay in the same room and have the group of people change, and what behaviors are considered to be deviant would still also be altered. Finally, deviance across place means that what is deviant in one place or culture may not be deviant in others. And so that's pretty simple to look at. Like, for example, in the Middle East, there are lots of things that were considered deviant there that would not be considered deviant in the United States, right? And so I had a lot of, culture shock going both ways and, viewing certain behaviors, certain fashion. I like, for example, we couldn't wear in the Emirates that I lived in, we couldn't wear sleeveless tops. Okay? I know in Dubai, people are in bikinis and stuff like that. I wasn't in Dubai. I was near Dubai in Sharjah. And Sharjah is the most conservative of the Emirates. And so you couldn't wear sleeveless tops, you couldn't show cleavage, you definitely couldn't wear, if you're a woman especially, you couldn't wear anything that was above the knee. And so if I traveled anywhere outside of the UAE during that 7 year period, it would take me a while to adjust to seeing like short shorts and men with no shirt on whatsoever. And so, yeah, even for me, somebody who was from a completely different place, eventually I became kind of, acclimated to the culture and started to, have to check myself, when I would see something that would surprise me a bit. Two other terms I want to define now, just because we're going to be talking about them later, not quite yet, um, and I want to make sure you know about them before we talk about them, are stigma and crime. So, stigma is basically a label that society uses to devalue members of specific groups, social groups. And stigma is like a tainted reputation or a marred identity. So stigma can be something that is actually visible, like a phenotype, like your skin color, your height, or something like that. It can be something that often is something that the person has no control over. And so it's often an ascribed status. It can also be an achieved status. If you think about the Scarlet Letter and the main character having to wear that red A for adultery on her clothing, that would be a form of stigma. And so often, like I said, it can be very physical. It can also be something that you are asked to reveal about yourself. Uh, so, for example, somebody who's had a felony or misdemeanor conviction can be stigmatized by being asked that on an application. And often this can be used to devalue them and to justify discrimination or prejudice against them. The other term I want to clarify is crime. So, crime is formalized and codified deviance, and it's a violation of laws enacted by society. I want to point out that crime does not equate negative, same with deviance. Crime doesn't mean bad, crime means illegal. And we know throughout history there have been plenty of things that have been considered criminal in the past that now we no longer would consider criminal, and it's really just about that place, space, and so we're going to start by talking about functionalist theories of deviance. And First, just going to talk about how the functionalists would view deviance altogether. So, according to the functionalist perspective, deviance is a common part of human existence with positive and negative consequences for social stability. On one hand, deviance clarifies rules. When there's a situation that we have to deal with in society that is new or that we haven't already encountered, um, those situations are often viewed as being deviant, and they help us to clarify rules so that we can have a system for dealing with those situations in the future. Deviance also unites a group. When a deviant act occurs, we often note that people within a certain group or identity will often experience a period of solidarity following that act. And often we'll see that people join together in order to push back against some forms of deviance. And often, deviance unites a group because a group becomes deviant in order to counter something else. For example, and this leads to a third function, if they want to promote social change. So if we think about the summer of George Floyd back in 2020, all of the protesters globally were all committing a deviant act in some way when they were protesting for social change, right? Because the status quo is the norm that's set by dominant ideology. And so anytime people go against that norm, even if they're all in agreement at the moment, or it seems like they're all in agreement, like it's the majority of people, not really. It's deviation, right? And it promotes social change. The norm would be to not react. So one of the things that is really important when it comes to deviance is social cohesion. And so if you look back at our discussions of Durkheim during the social interaction and societal structure lessons, he talks about how social cohesion influences a society. So social cohesion being the way that we form our bonds, our relationships, just how we get along every day. And so Durkheim in particular was interested in studying our collective behavior or the collective conscience, communal beliefs, morals, attitudes of a society. You can go back to our previous recording for more content on that. I believe it's the society and social structure recording or social interaction. Um, and he talks about mechanical solidarity. He talks about organic solidarity. But really, what I want to point out here is that he talks a lot about integration as a part of that solidarity. So, integration is basically how much we are involved and engaged in community and in our society. And Durkheim is really concerned about what happens when we are not integrated into our society and community, or if we are overly integrated into our society and community. And another thing that he was really interested in was what happens when we are overregulated. That means when our social controls, we'll talk about what those are in a moment, when our social controls become either too weak or too strong. And so basically, our social controls are any techniques and strategies that are used to prevent deviant human behavior in society. We're all under social control. Sometimes they're informal social controls, like casual methods that are used for enforcing norms, like smiling or laughing or raising an eyebrow or ridiculing someone. And sometimes they're formal social controls, like those things that are carried out by authorized agents, people that our society has given power to be in authority. So some examples here would be police officers, judges, administrators, and employers. And another thing that's interesting when it comes to social control is the direction in which it's coming from. Are you conforming? Meaning, are you going along with peers and those who are of a similar status? Or are you obeying? Meaning that you're complying with those authorities in a hierarchical structure. So, a couple of interesting tidbits. You'll notice that there's the three stars next to a couple of things on this slide. And that means that they may not be covered very thoroughly or at all in your text, but they're still important for you to know. So, hey, I'm up here now because I wanted to move out of the way because I really want you to see this really good figure that explains Durkheim's normative theory of suicide. Um, it's not from your text. I stole it from another textbook. But I do want to mention that obviously this theory is his normative theory of suicide. You'll remember in our first lecture where we talked about Durkheim a bit, or at least in the reading, and how he was one of the first people to note that suicide wasn't just an individual decision, that it's influenced by society. And this is the theory that he became famous for regarding that. However, Durkheim's theory of suicide can also be applied to deviance and deviant behavior overall. Okay, and you'll note it in a moment. However, in the examples that I'm going to give, I am going to use suicide because suicide is a form of deviance and it relates to his original theory. So again, you'll notice that there's an x-axis and a y-axis here, and that at the in the horizontal direction we have social regulation. So this is our social control again, and we're looking at patterns of when it's too high or too low. And then on the vertical axis, we have social integration or that sense of belonging and of being a part of a community, and what happens when that's too high or too low. Now, the sweet spot is right in the middle, in the center, right? Where there's just enough of each, but not too much, not too little. And we're going to go into all of these four forms or influences for deviance, depending on the location of integration and or regulation. So let's make it work. Let's do it. Okay, so when it comes to the reactions, being altruistic, anomic, fatalistic, and egoistic, these are all types of anomie. And so basically it means that there's a loss of direction, that there's some chaos, right? And so really the difference between these is whether there's too much or too little integration or too much or too little social regulation. So let's start with egoistic. This would be a situation where society has too little integration, where people feel very isolated. There are weak bonds, there are weak groups, and people are not very much tied to society. In an egoistic society or situation, you might note that people are highly individualistic. They may feel like they're all alone, and this is not good, right? We're not meant to be in that state. And so you will see increases in suicide rates and in deviance as a result. On the other end of that spectrum, we have altruistic anomie, and that's where there's too much integration. Everyone is focused here on not the individual, but the betterment of the group and the group above all else. Here, the bonds are way too strong, and often individuals, either voluntarily or involuntarily, are expected to sacrifice themselves. So, with altruism, really it's looking at that term altruism, which means selfless or self, beyond self. And here, people are either committing acts of martyrdom, so they're committing suicide for a cause or for something they believe in or for society, the good of society, or they might be forced, like in the case of uh, World War II imperialist Japan, where we noted pilots, they're famously known as kamikaze pilots, who were literally expected to, as fuel ran out and it was known that they couldn't make a trip back, they were expected to not only bomb areas, but to use their plane and themselves as a part of that bomb. So suicide bombers. Um, and most of them did this not because they were necessary. Some did because they were, you know, actually altruistic, but others because the other option would be shame, right? That it would be a dishonor, and then you would have no life to live because of that altruistic, very collective society. Now, going into regulation, we have anomic, where there's too little regulation, right? There's a breakdown of social controls. To me, I think of like Mad Max or what's another one? The Purge or something like that. And for me, it makes me very uncomfortable. I like to say that I do what I want and things like that, but I am actually a rule follower for the most part. I like rules. I mean, I follow most of them. I do like to break some as well. And so we're we actually need some order. And when we don't have any, if there's anarchy, if we're not regulated by norms or values or some sort of social order, that's not good for us. And so I'm not saying we need to be under a like a totalitarian regime or anything like that, but we do need to have some common understandings and expectations. Having a completely unpredictable life would be so stressful, and the anxiety would be huge. Um, so that's anomic. And then on the other end there, we have fatalistic, where there's too much regulation and society sets too many expectations, right? The norms are way too oppressive. And especially if you combine this with altruism, where everybody's in everyone's business, this can be like 1984, the George Orwell story of a dystopian, society. And here, individuals feel stifled. They feel like they don't have any options. They don't have any choices or control over their own lives. So that, in a nutshell, explains Durkheim's normative theory of suicide and deviance. So now we have another functionalist theory of deviance from Robert Merton, which is kind of similar to Durkheim's in some way. It tries to explain, why individuals commit deviant acts. But here, instead of using integration and regulation, we instead look at the availability of legitimate goals, legitimate meaning legal or acceptable, and legitimate means in society. So here, a legitimate goal would be what is the end that you're supposed to want to accomplish, right? And does your society actually have legitimate goals, right? What are those things, right? And then on the legitimate means, it's the ways that we go about reaching those goals. right? And do you have access to legitimate ways of going about those goals? So, for example, if you were, hmm, let's see, um, a college student who wanted to have a job in education, right? The legitimate goal is what? It's wanting to have the job in education. And the legitimate means here would be going through education as a student. Now, illegitimate means would be hiring someone else to do your education for you and then going to work in that goal. And illegitimate goals would be those objectives that our society views as being inappropriate. Like most people don't hold legitimate goals of like, or illegitimate goals like, I want to be a street pharmacist when I grow up. So we're going to go through 5 individual treatments that Merton says result from the access to these legitimate goals and means. So the first is conformity, which actually is not deviant, it's the non-deviant treatment, which means that one accepts the means and the goals. So you're a goody two shoes. You're like me, you're a rule follower. You're not very risky, perhaps, or you just don't want to take a lot of risk. And you just want, maybe some simple things in life, or at least you want to go about them in a legitimate way. The rest are deviant. Okay, so the first one for the deviant side here is the innovator, and this person accepts the goals, but they actually pursue them with illegitimate means. Okay, so an innovator would be someone who wants the acceptable goals in life, but goes about them using illegitimate means. So, from the example that I gave about somebody who wants to be an educator, but hires someone else to go to school for them, definitely would be an innovator, right? Or somebody who wants to have a house and a home and things like that, but who becomes a drug dealer to do that would also be considered an innovator. A ritualist is the exact opposite, where the person abandons the goals, but they accept the means. So, for example, they may not care about the actual success or objective at the end, but they still might enjoy or commit to the means or the rituals involved. And you'll see this a lot in bureaucracy, where people get so wrapped up in following the rules and the process that they forget about the actual goal, which is to help someone, right? Um, the next example is retreatism, and this is where the person has retreated from or rejected both the goals and the means of society, right? So they're not seeking the legitimate goals, they're also not seeking legitimate means, or they're not using legitimate means to go about any goals. And the name for it actually really describes well what it is. It means you're retreating from society, or you're retreating from that social contract with the legitimate goals and or means. A good example for this one would be somebody who may be living on the outskirts of society. They may be a hermit. They may be somebody who is like dealing with addiction and has kind of rejected those goals and means and replaced them with something. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that because the next one, rebel, is similar, except that they have replaced their goals and means. So with retreatists, they have retreated from the goals and means altogether. And then last, we have a rebel or rebellion. And this is where, again, they have rejected the means, rejected the goals. But the difference between rebellion and retreatism is that now we are replacing those legitimate means and legitimate goals. So think about like a revolutionary who wants to change social structure, and they may want to do this using unconventional means. So we could think about, I don't know, January the 6th and those who went and rebelled against the Capitol. And so they wanted different goals. They wanted to overturn an election, and they went about it using different means as well. So again, this is Merton string theory. It's a fun little one. All right, and another theory of deviance from the functionalist looks at disorganization theory. And this theory says that increases in crime and deviance can be attributed to the absence or breakdown of communal relationships in social institutions. So basically, saying that those institutions serve a function and that deviance can be the result of a dysfunction in those institutions. It includes something called broken windows theory, which is a simplification, or a more, I guess, a more colorful way of explaining this theory. It explains how social cues impact whether individuals act deviantly. So, for example, if you live in an area where there are broken windows and those windows are never repaired, then you might feel like there is less care for your community in general, and maybe you won't care for your community as well. Or you might feel um, you know, a negative response, anger, and so you might also participate in acts of vandalism as well. And so basically, here they believe that local or informal social norms actually allow the deviant acts. And that's why it's important to repair your window when it breaks, because if you leave it for too long, people will think that you want broken windows. Um, and so this one is actually very problematic because it's got some victim blaming in this, that it doesn't take the macro level social forces into account or hold them accountable enough. And that's really looking at individuals and blaming them for their own environment. And it focuses a lot on superficial things. Repairing windows and planting trees, while these things are nice, they don't fix the social institutions and inequalities and injustices that are faced by people in disorganized communities. Now we go into interactionist theories of deviance, namely the differential association theory and labeling theory. Labeling theory, I do want to specify that it is also a conflict theory of deviance as well. And so this is one of those really interesting situations where we have a theory that is both macro and micro, or can be used from both directions. I also want to mention that I'm not necessarily skipping conflict perspectives because many are related to labeling theory. Your book does a light treatment of those, and you should review those, especially looking at what Karl Marx says and what Max Weber says. Okay. So with differential association theory, basically this is where we think about the influence of our social interactions, our exposure of um, of our exposure to attitudes that are favorable to criminal acts and how those lead to the violation of rules. And so for this one, I like to use the idiom birds of a feather flock together, because this is saying that you're going to have a greater tendency to deviate from social norms when you're frequently associating with individuals who are more favorable towards deviance than conformity. And here it says that improper behavior can be the result of types of groups one belongs to and the kinds of friendships a person has. However, I like to challenge this theory more than agree with it, because I believe that people who are more likely to indulge in deviant behavior are more likely to hang out with people who are indulging in deviant behavior. Unless you're talking about like full on like family socialization, right? In which like your family is raising you to be deviant. I mean, maybe that has some weight, right? Because social environment does matter. But I do believe that for adolescents, especially, that they're going to be more likely to choose friends who are engaging in deviant behavior if they are interested in that deviant behavior as well. Um, the other theory here, labeling theory, we're going to spend quite some time on. Labeling theory doesn't aim to explain why individuals come to commit deviant acts, but instead asks why certain people are allowed to dictate what is deviant and what is not, and why certain acts are viewed as deviant and others are not, right? And so labeling theory flips it around, and instead of saying, why do individuals do deviant things, it asks, why are certain things that individuals do viewed as being deviant? Okay. And so you can probably see, for obvious reasons, you've been getting to know me this semester, why I like this theory the most. It focuses less on the people who violate social norms and instead focuses on those who create the social norms, those who are the regulators of social control. So here we're looking at judges, teachers, psychiatrists, police, right? Why do some individuals have the power to define labels and apply them to others, right? And so one of the areas, and this will show you why we're going back into conflict if you're not already with us here, that we look at is things like racial profiling, right? Or things like gender norms, right? And violations of gender norms. Who gets to decide or construct these ideas of what's normative, right? And why do they do that? Okay. Another thing we look at is the difference between primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is really the first act of rule breaking, and it can be very meaningful. Most of us have kind of, we've contributed to some deviant acts in our lifetime. And one of the things that makes a difference as to whether we continue to do those deviant acts is whether we get away with that deviant act, and whether or not we receive a label, right? And that goes back to our discussions of self fulfilling prophecies before as well, and looking at secondary deviance, right? Deviant acts that occur after primary deviance can be a result of that primary deviant label, right? That new deviant label. And you're either accepting it like a self fulfilling prophecy situation, or you're leaning into it because that's your new identity that you have adopted, right? So now, after talking about this theory, why do you think it's considered a conflict theory as well? Why does it cross into both?